Here at Winfield United Methodist Church called Grace in Winfield, Kansas, we have an adult education program, and we welcome not only those members of Grace who watch the video, but those who watch the video from afar and are to become stimulated in their journey of faith and thought and conversation. So we welcome all of you, whether or not you're a part of our congregation. Um, right now, in our journey of digging deeper into our experiences of prayer, we're for 3 weeks looking at 3 perils of prayer, 3 dangers of prayer. Last week we talked about using prayer as a cop-out, as a substitute for doing good. But this week we're exploring a second peril of prayer, and that is using and wearing the act of verbal prayer as a badge that confirms one as being faithful, the proof of which is praying in a certain way in certain places, a badge to be worn and on display. What does this look like? Well, Jack and Jane called and said they wanted to visit, not their real names. I knew Jane had joined a Bible study, which was led by persons who were not part of the congregation which I served and to which Jack and Jane belonged. They came in and shared to Jane, who shared in tears, came home from the study believing that she was no longer adequate in her faith. She was not adequate because, number one, she was uncomfortable in not being willing to take her turn in leading the group in prayer. Secondly, her family did not say grace before they ate. And thirdly, she did not pray a bedside prayer with her children before they slept. Now, there was more, but I remember those 3. As a consequence of getting to know Jane, the group targeted her that she needed to grow in her faith. So she would learn the art of verbal prayer, a mark of spiritual maturity. Now, Jack and Jane were caring neighbors, extended themselves in amazing gestures and support and acceptance, enabled their children to be respectful, life-loving children. Jane's faith all of a sudden was undermined by this group. She was lacking, and her faith was broken. And Jack said, Bruce, I told Jane she needed to get out of this group. And Jack said to Jane, Jane, you have a heart of gold. You don't need any badge to prove it. To make a long story short, so you'll know the end of the story, Jack and Jane split, not from each other, but from beloved friends, many of whom were in that Bible study, who targeted her for, in Jack's language, they targeted his wife for not wearing the badge of verbal prayer. Now, from that conversation that happened many years ago, 35 years ago, a little bit more than that, but I've never forgotten it. But I can share many stories where certain forms of verbal prayer are worn as badges of spiritual maturity. My love and respect for this couple, and reading time and time again the prelude of Jesus to the Lord's Prayer, I have personally had an aversion to praying in certain circumstances when I felt it was only a prayer, a badge to be worn. Most of my growth in faith is because of the gifts from laity. And that gift from that conversation with Jack and Jane that day, um, labeling the peril of prayer when used as a badge of spiritual maturity, have had an impact on my life. And one of the impacts is that hundreds of times Karen and I have shocked friends in public restaurants when we have shared our reluctance to say grace before a meal because of my fear of prayer being a public badge for others to see. As a person of faith, what I need is that heart of gold, not a badge to wear. I share this as a confession, probably of my own spiritual immaturity. Others are comfortable in doing what I simply can no longer do. And the scripture passage of Jesus addressing those who he invites to go on a journey of faith with him is in prelude to the Lord's Prayer. And we oftentimes forget this prelude. And when you pray, you must not be like the hypocrites, the actors who wear a different face in Greek plays. That's what hypocrite means. For they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the street corners, that they may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they've received their reward. When you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who is in secret will reward you. I read this passage as a warning concerning this peril of prayer. Using and wearing the act of prayer as a badge of spiritual maturity. Oftentimes, prayers of empty phrases to be seen and heard by others are not a sign of spiritual maturity, but rather, according to Jesus, a sign of hypocrisy, a badge of hypocrisy. Certainly not an act of aligning with the divine. Now, badges come in many forms. Sometimes the clothes one wears, the jewelry with which we are adorned, all are badges to be seen by others, and often verbal prayer is exercised as a badge of spiritual maturity to be seen by others, but considered by Jesus to be a sign of hypocrisy. Our working definition of prayer in this series is to align with the divine. It is my conviction that prayer with others is an inviting invitation to pray to be heard by others rather than to align ourselves with agape love. As we consider this peril of prayer, the question must be addressed, how can we avoid this peril? My experience is that we need to be as careful in verbal prayer as we are in every act of faith. Prayer as a badge too often is a routine, casual, repetitive, and full of empty phrases. Nothing in the community of the faithful is as sacred as the experience of prayer. Prayer is not a badge of spiritual maturity. Rather, it is a practice demanding humility and clarity. It's the human experience of aligning with divine love, not an exercise to be heard by others or to obtain God's blessing to align with us. As several saints have said, faith is not a quest for God to be on our side. It's a quest to be on God's side. So it is with prayer. To align with the divine is not for the purpose of God aligning with us. Indeed, the hymn writers captured the message well. The words are not, they will know we are Christians by our prayers. Rather, the hymn writer says they'll know we are Christians by our love, aligning with the divine. Some questions that you might consider for your thoughts and conversation. What are your personal experiences of verbal prayer being considered as a badge of spiritual maturity? What other than prayer, clothing, and jewelry are common badges of faith in our culture today? And finally, what is your response to Jesus referring to verbal prayers spoken to be heard by others as acts of hypocrisy? Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to next week.